أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولنبلونكم حتى نعلم المجاهدين منكم والصابرين ونبلو أخباركم.
The Miracle 19, or Code 19 of the Quran, has definitely impacted our Muslim nation. This video will clearly demonstrate the ultimate flaw of the mathematical Miracle 19, proving that Rashad Khalifa and the 19ers were definitely wrong through their own method. You will witness a mathematical deceptive number manipulation tactic or trick, and additionally, an important miscalculation by Rashad Khalifa concerning the total counts of Allah, God. This is not going to be easy for the 19ers at all, because I used to be one of them a long time ago, and it was difficult too. Nonetheless, I believe you all need to see the truth about this, as there is a much more significant meaning and warning about over it is 19. عَلَيْهَا تِسْعَةَ عَشَرٍ in Surah 74 verse 30. Therefore, let me first show you the ultimate flaw of the mathematical code 19 through Rashad Khalifa's 4th revised edition of the English Quran, the green Quran here. If you go to Appendix 1, which is on page 609, the heading says, one of the great miracles, Surah 74 verse 35. Then below it, near the middle right, Rashad Khalifa explains in his own words the purpose of the code 19 as follows. There are two major facets of the Quran's mathematical system. 1. The mathematical literary composition. Now pay close attention to the second major facet here. And 2. The mathematical structure involving the numbers of surahs and verses. Because of this comprehensive mathematical coding, the slightest distortion of the Quran's text or physical arrangement is immediately exposed. This is what Rashad Khalifa thinks and believes concerning the Code 19. For those who are not aware of the Code 19, it is basically the methodology of dividing certain mathematical properties of the Quran by the number 19, such as letters, word count, concatenation, etc. Thus, to him and the 19ers, the number 19 protects the Quran through this elementary arithmetic way, the division. In other words, by conducting divisions of the number 19 in specific ways to the 19ers, it must make a multiple of 19. That's how the Quran is protected from any alteration, according to them. So, being a multiple of 19 to them means it's authentic or sahih. If it is not a multiple of 19, it's not protected. That is what Rashad Khalifa is trying to say by the slightest distortion of the Quran's text or physical arrangement is immediately exposed. Unfortunately, almost all the 19ers agree to that as well. Keep that in mind. This does not seem so bad or erroneous-like approach, which did not cause any reproach. But what really caught my attention and what really bothered me and pretty much the whole Muslim nation is the fact that because of the Code 19, Rashad Khalifa rejected or disbelieved 2 verses of the glorious Quran. And they are famously known to be Surah 9, Bara or Tawbah, the last 2 verses, 128 and 129. So if you go to page 207 in his English translation version of the Quran, you will notice that Surah 9 ends at verse 127. The subheading above this verse says, a historical crime unveiled, tampering with the words of God. God provides irrefutable evidence. And below, at the footnotes, he says the following. You have Surah 9 verse 1 and Surah 9 verse 127. This is the only surah that is not prefixed with the Bismillah. This phenomenon has puzzled the students of the Quran for 14 centuries, and many theories were advanced to explain it. Now we realize that the conspicuous absence of the Bismillah serves 3 purposes. 1. It represents an advanced divine proclamation that the idol worshippers were destined to tamper with the Quran by adding 2 false verses, 128 and 129 of Surah 9. 2. It demonstrates one of the functions of God's mathematical code in the Quran, namely to guard the Quran against any alteration. And 3, it provides additional miraculous features of the Quran's code. Due to its extraordinary importance, the details are given in appendices 24 and 29. Let's put a pause right here on this because this is where we see a clear example of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala testing us with this. As presented in the beginning of this video, Surah 47 verse 31 ends by saying, "We will test your information." Now, if these two verses were completely removed from this English Quran, then that would violate a specific verse of the Quran, which is in Surah 15, Hijr, verse 9, as follows.
إنا نحن نزلنا الذكر وإن له لحافظون.
Indeed, we have sent down the reminder, and indeed we are surely guardians for it. Thus, if these two verses were removed completely from this English Quran, then that would have violated that verse, Surah 15 verse 9. However, technically, Surah 9 verse 128 and verse 129 are not completely removed from Rashad Khalifa's English translation of the Quran. These two verses are located in a different place in his English Quran, as it is said in his footnote here. The details are given in appendices 24 and 29. Therefore, let's go to appendix 24 at page 669. Ironically, Rashad Khalifa is very aware of Surah 15 verse 9, as you can see here, but he thinks that 15 verse 9 means the Quran is mathematically composed, as he says here. If we go to page 671, you can find Rashad Khalifa's translation of Surah 9 verse 128 and 129 here as follows. A messenger has come to you from among you who wants no hardship to afflict you and cares about you and is compassionate towards the believers, merciful. If they turn away, then say, "Sufficient for me is God. There is no God except He. I put my trust in Him. He is the Lord with the great throne." That is Rashad Khalifa's translation of Surah 9 verse 128 and 129. Technically, this therefore proves that these two verses are still in his English translation of the Quran, but in a different location, in appendix 24, page 671. Thus Allah is testing us with this information. However, Rashad Khalifa does not believe them to be Quranic verses because of a couple of contradictory reasons, such as the false hadith's interpretation of those verses, and mainly because of the mathematical calculations that starts on this page all the way until we get to page 687, in which is under the heading as the ultimate Quranic miracle. We're going to focus on the ultimate Quranic miracle because this is what convinced Rashad Khalifa and the 19ers. So, on the 62nd justification on page 687, appendix 24, this is where the ultimate 19 code disasters will be seen, inshallah. And this is also, unfortunately, what Rashad Khalifa considers the ultimate Quranic miracle as follows. So here in the 62nd, Brother Abdullah Arik has discovered what I consider to be the ultimate Quranic miracle. So Rashad Khalifa is saying this. This miraculous phenomenon incontrovertibly authenticates every single verse in the Quran, the number of verses in every surah, and the numbers assigned to every single verse in the Quran, while exposing and rejecting the false injections. Surah 9 verse 128 and 129. To witness this great phenomenon, see page appendix 1 under the heading Superhuman Numerical Combinations. Hence, we have to now go to appendix 1. You have to then go to page 630 because that is where the heading Superhuman Numerical Combinations is located in appendix 1. So to better visualize and appreciate this, a website was made by them, the 19ers, to easily calculate these appendices. They called this the Quran Inspector at www.submission.org/QI #/mod19. The QI here obviously stands for Quran Inspector. So we are now at the Quran Inspector. What you are about to see, anyone with a computer can verify, and I strongly recommend all the 19ers to do this and witness for themselves the ultimate flaws of the Code 19. So here, in the Quran Inspector, you have two main sections. In the right rectangle, you have the appendices with the calculations which were on page 630 of Appendix 1. If you click on Appendix 121 here, the left rectangle section will populate with numbers. These numbers are basically the sequential concatenation or arrangement of all the individual verses of the Quran from the first verse of Surah 1 to its last verse, verse 7, and then the following surah with its 286 verses in its sequential order, all the way to the last surah which ends with the number 6, thus forming a very long number of over 12,000 digits. This is the concept of Appendix 121 until Appendix 127, and a few others that we will be seeing. Now, it is important to understand the main differences between these appendices because this is a perfect example of number manipulation. For example, Appendix 121 and Appendix 122 are very similar, but if you noticed, Appendix 122 changed. So if we look at Appendix 121, there is a 7 before the sequence of verses 1 to 7. The 7 simply means that there are 7 verses, and then it's sequence of 1 to 7. Then you have 286, which is the next surah 2, Baqarah, followed by its sequence from 1 to 286, and so on till the end of the Quran. But in Appendix 1 to 2, instead of the 7 being in front, like in Appendix 1 to 1 here, the 7 is at the end of the sequence, thus number manipulation. Then, the next sequence has 1 to 286, and then at the end of the sequence you have again 286. So Appendix 1 to 2 is pretty much the same thing as Appendix 1 to 1, but its total verses of each surah are at the end of the sequenced verses instead of the beginning. But there is another addition to Appendix 1 to 2 at the end. 6,234 is added or concatenated at the end to indicate the total verses in the Quran. If Surah 9, verse 128 and 129 were removed, as you can see here below, you can check this ballpoint to either remove verse 128 and 129 from Surah 9 or put them back by checking on the ballpoint on the right here. Just to make this very clear so you can try this at home if you are new to this. If we go to Surah 9 till the end of its verses, you can remove the 2 verses by checking on the ballpoint on the left here. I'm looking for 127, as you can see, 127 in Surah 9. Now, if I check on the ballpoint on the right here, which says verses in chapter 9 equals 129, look where I highlighted 127, you will see 128 and 129 appear. You see, they appeared. This is crucial for you to understand for what you are about to see. Now look, when I remove those verses, 128 and 129, by clicking on verses in chapter 9 equals 127, as there are now 127 verses in Surah 9, then click on divide, which will automatically divide it by 19, and then below it, it says remainder 0, and below that it confirms that the number is a multiple of 19, number of digits in the input number, 12,696. However, if I add back the 2 verses by clicking on verses in chapter 9 equals 129, and then click on divide, it says remainder 14, and below that, the number is not a multiple of 19. Number of digits in the input number, 12,702. Remember, this is what Rashad Khalifa considers the ultimate Quranic miracle in his own words. This miraculous phenomenon incontrovertibly authenticates every single verse in the Quran, the number of verses in every surah, the numbers assigned to every single verse in the Quran, while exposing and rejecting the false injections, Surah 9 verse 128 and 129. This is how he and all the 19ers see what I just showed you in the Quran Inspector. Thus, this is their official method of verifying if it is Quranic or it is not Quranic. Now here is the first ultimate flaw of the Code 19. Keep in mind that Surah 9 verse 128 and 129 are added here now. And by dividing it by 19, it does not make a multiple of 19. However, if I remove 6,236 and not 6,234 here at the end, and put it in the beginning, which this number was added by them anyways, it does not violate any of their rules, and then simply hit divide, the 19ers' natural prediction is that this cannot be a multiple of 19. Let's see. And it is. Look, remainder 0. And below that, it confirms that the number is a multiple of 19. Number of digits in the input number, 12,702. Now, if I applied the same concept by removing the two verses by clicking on verses in chapter 9 equals 127, in other words, removing 6,234 at the end and putting it in the beginning and then click divide, and look, remainder is 16, and below that, the number is not a multiple of 19. Number of digits in the input number, 12,696. That was the first ultimate flaw of the 19 code. There are another 11 flaws like this that you will see and that everyone can easily verify on their computers or cell phones. So let me just recap this one before we head on to the next ones, as this will get even more obvious and more evident of how flawed this concept really is. So in Appendix 1 to 2, by adding the two verses in Surah 9 verse 128 and 129, in which Rashad Khalifa and most 19ers consider false or not quranic, then removing or cutting 6,236 at the end here and putting or pasting it in the beginning, then hitting the divide button, the number is a multiple of 19. Hence, these two verses, according to their method, is part of the Quran and authentic. But by removing the two verses and applying the same concept, it will no longer be a multiple of 19. This is therefore a clear contradiction and proof of inconsistency of the code 19, because by removing or leaving these two verses, you will still get a multiple of 19. As a result, this ultimate Quranic miracle is not a miracle at all, but an ultimate calculation disaster of the code 19, in which Rashad Khalifa invented. It's important to note that one of the main rules of mathematics is, if there is one flaw in the formula, then everything is doubtful concerning it. That's a rule of thumb. This should not be the case if those verses are false. Since there is one flaw, which you just saw, and you can easily verify, that means there should be many flaws. That's one of mathematics' greatest properties, the power of prediction. It's either flawed or flawless. You will see how flawed this is because there are 11 more like the one we just saw here on the right, a total of 12. Now you should have a better understanding of this. I will be going through them a bit quicker. So, we just saw the first ultimate flaw of the mathematical code 19, and now the second ultimate flaw. It is in Appendix 1 to 5. All you have to do to make this a multiple of 19 with Surah 9 verse 129 as the last verse is to add 6,236 verses at the end and then hit divide. And voila, the number is a multiple of 19. But if we remove the last two verses and add 6,234 at the end, the number is not a multiple of 19. Do you see the number manipulation yet? If not, it's going to get clear very soon, inshallah. Now here's the third one. Click on Appendix 1 to 8 and make sure you have 129 as the last verse of Surah 9 here. Do you see this new number that is added in the beginning? 333,667? This is the total sum of all the individual verses of the Quran with Surah 9 verse 128 and 129. If I click on verses in chapter 9 equals 127, thus removing those two verses, the total sum of all the individual verses of the Quran is now 333,410, which subtracted verses 128 and 129, as you can see. So, by clicking back on verses in chapter 9 equals 129, and then remove 6,236 and 114 from the beginning, and then hit divide by 19, and guess what? Another multiple of 19. With Surah 9 verse 128 and 129 included. Is the number manipulation getting a bit clearer now? Let's go to the fourth ultimate flaw here. Copy 333,667 from this appendix 1 to 8 and then paste it in the beginning of appendix 1 to 6. 333,667 makes more sense in this appendix 1 to 6 as the sum of the verses of each surah are presented here. As you can easily first see Surah Baqarah's sum 41,041 as well as the rest. Thus, by adding or concatenating the total sum of all the individual verses of the Quran, 333,667 in the beginning of Appendix 1 to 6, and then input or concatenate 6,236 at the end, then hit divide with verses in chapter 9 equals 129, the number is a multiple of 19. If you found that one weird because 333,667 was in the beginning and 6,236 at the end, then at this same appendix 1 to 6, you have the fifth ultimate flaw as well. Removes 333,667 from the beginning and add or concatenate it after 6,236 that was added at the end. Like this. And then hit divide. Another multiple of 19 with verses in chapter 9 equals 129. That was pretty cool, but unfortunately filled with flaws, and these contradictions only get worse. Welcome to the sixth ultimate flaw. Again, in this same appendix, 1 to 6. Reverse these two components, 6,236 and 333,667, which would be 333,667 and 6,236, like that, and hit divide, voila, another multiple of 19 with verses in chapter 9 equals 129. That seemed quite phenomenal as those components were reversed and still made a multiple of 19. Nonetheless, it's still self-contradicting by being a multiple of 19 without removing the two verses which Rashad Khalifa thought to be false. It should be clear by now that this is purely number manipulation, and that brings us to the seventh ultimate flaw. Click on Appendix 1 to 10, add 333,667 and 6,236 at the beginning. Remove 333,667 from the end, and hit divide. I'm sure you can guess now, a multiple of 19 with verses in chapter 9 equals 129. The eighth ultimate flaw is also in Appendix 1 to 10. Simply reverse the same two components, 333,667 and 6,236 to 6,236 and 333,667 in the beginning. Hit divide. Another multiple of 19. No, 333,667 concatenated with 6,236 and 6,236 concatenated with 333,667 are not multiples of 19. The ninth ultimate flaw is in Appendix 1 to 12. Remove 114, 6,236, and 333,667 from the beginning and add at the end 114 and 6,236 only. Hit divide. Voila, another multiple of 19. The 10th ultimate flaw is also in Appendix 1 to 12. Remove 114, 6,236, and 333,667 from the beginning and add only 333,667 at the end. And here we have a dual multiple of 19. The number is a multiple of 19 and the number of digits in the input number is also a multiple of 19. 12,711. A 19 thing. We are now at the 11th ultimate flaw here in the Quran Inspector. This is a terrible number manipulation. Click on Appendix 1 to 13. 6,234 or 6,236 is at the beginning and at the ending. It's repeated twice. This is truly a terrible number manipulation. They seem to be trying anything that works. Okay, so remove both 6,236 in the beginning and the end and replace it with 333,667 at the beginning and at the end. Another multiple of 19. I know that was weak, but that was their own rule. It just keeps getting worse though. So if you haven't noticed by now, they, Rashad Khalifa and the 19ers, are trying all the logical options to make multiples of 19, even if it's unlogical. And they are so desperate in doing so that they are putting repeated components so it becomes a multiple of 19. And finally, you have the last one, the 12th ultimate flaw in Appendix 1 to 14. You have 6,236 and 114 at the beginning and at the end. Twice again. So remove both of them, this terrible number manipulation, and voila, a multiple of 19 without those repetitions with Surah 9 verse 129 as the last verse. Thus, this certifies that this is not how the Quran is protected, as it protects nothing and it proves nothing. Henceforth, what Rashad Khalifa considers the ultimate Quranic miracle, in his own words, This miraculous phenomenon incontrovertibly authenticates every single verse in the Quran, the numbers of verses in every surah, and the numbers assigned to every single verse in the Quran, while exposing and rejecting the false injections, Surah 9 verse 128 and 129, is therefore a clear lie and a contradiction and a proof of inconsistency, because by removing or leaving those two verses, you can still get a multiple of 19. As a result, this ultimate Quranic miracle is not a miracle at all, but an ultimate calculation disaster of the Code 19 in which Rashad Khalifa invented. This proves mathematically that this is not the correct method. I would like to remind you again that one of the main rules of mathematics is if there is one flaw in a formula, then everything can be doubtful concerning it. That's a rule of thumb. But since you have been presented 12 clear flaws through their own findings, which you just saw, and you can easily verify, that means this whole concept of dividing Quranic properties by the number 19 is definitely faulty, defective, imperfect, and inconsistent. Hence, flawed, not trustworthy. This also proves that Rashad Khalifa and those who participated with him are not mathematicians, nor physicists or engineers, mechanical software, etc., or any experts on this field, or someone who applies all the known possibilities in order to remove doubts. Thus, they were in no position to make any of these decisions, and they should have verified it with other qualified, non-biased experts. To remove 2 verses from the glorious Quran is not a joke. This is a very serious matter, as they are the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You must believe in His words. God does not tell us to divide them by 19. There are many more things that can be said for the last 2 verses in Surah 9 verse 128 and 129, such as the first reasoning which Rashad Khalifa says in his Appendix 24. He first bases this on false hadiths in which he himself rejects and disbelieves in them. That is obviously contradictory to him because he rejects the false hadiths and all those who follow the Quran alone. This is the reason why he doubted them, as the false hadiths said they were added. Please read that. Thus, the reasoning to have doubted those verses is absolutely satanically based. Then he rejects them based on calculations which you just saw that are flawed and through number manipulation. He also rejected them because of his word count of the name of Allah, God, which he again miscalculated. He has obtained a false and incorrect